Hey Wildcats, it's Ms. Henson with a quick tutorial here on narrative writing. Now, narrative, remember, is the big fancy ELA, vocabulary term for writing a story. So when we talk about narrative writing, we're talking about story writing. One of the major elements you have to consider when you're writing a narrative is imagery. So remember, imagery is all about sensory language, making images in your reader's brain. So you should always make sure that as you're writing your story and you're providing descriptions, that you include sights, sounds, tastes, touches, smells, so that your reader can better access what your characters are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching as it's appropriate. This is what helps the world of your story come alive for your reader. And remember, as you're writing your narrative, you need to have at least two of these to be well-rounded. There is such a thing as providing too much imagery description to the point that your reader gets so bogged down in all of the descriptions that it almost becomes annoying. You have to find a good balance when you're utilizing imagery. So here's a sample. I remember the days when the warm sun touched the tops of the trees in the woods behind my childhood home, making the vibrant green leaves grow. They would beckon to my brother and I to go walking amongst their sweet-smelling trunks and surround ourselves with nature. Peace permeated the area and soothed nerves that had been frayed from living in a home that felt more like a tense battlefield. So as you can see, this sample does a great job of using imagery but not overplaying the imagery card. It talks about the warm sun touching the tops of the trees behind their childhood home. Now you'll notice they don't get into a big description of this childhood home, but the fact that it is someone's childhood home can help the reader conjure up maybe images of their own childhood home. It talks about the vibrant green leaves. All right, so not only what color are the leaves, green, suggesting warmth and summertime, as opposed to, the burnt oranges of the fall leaves, but also that they're vibrant, they're shining, they're really bright, which we also think of as summer. So we're seeing parallel imagery here as well. I also like the imagery this writer uses in that very last sentence where they talk about peace permeating the area, all right, as juxtaposed with the idea of this tense battlefield that is their house. So, it means something very specific to call the home that they're living in a battlefield. That conjures up tension, suspense, all right, and images of kind of angst that gives us an idea of maybe why the character is seeking refuge in nature. So this is an excellent description to start out a story with. You'll notice it also provides a sense of place. You even, at the very end, get a little bit idea of the conflict that might be facing our characters. Also, when you're writing a narrative, you want to pay very close attention to pacing. All narratives should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You want to try to avoid the formulaic once upon a time and the end. Those work for children's stories for a reason. When you're 5 and 6 years old, you're establishing the concept that when you tell a story, you have to have a beginning, a middle, and the end. But we're more sophisticated writers now at the high school level, so we really want to avoid the tropes of once upon a time and writing the end in big letters at the end of our story. But it's super important that you take your reader on a journey and that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to that, making sure that the timeline of your story is smooth. There shouldn't be any major gaps in timelines and no time skips. Your character needs to be able to account for time. I will note that the more complex that you make the timeline of your story, all right, the more challenging of a story it is to write. One of my favorite movies is Back to the Future, the old 1980s movie starring Michael J. Fox, where Marty McFly accidentally takes his DeLorean up to 88 miles an hour and he goes back to the future. But anytime you start time traveling in a story, all right, you make for a much more complicated storyline. So I would always suggest keeping your timeline simple, particularly in smaller stories. The less space you have to write, the easier it is to keep with a very simple timeline. One of the key elements of narratives that distinguish a narrative from other writing genres is the fact that it has dialogue, which is the fancy ELA term for when characters talk to each other. All right. One of the things when you're writing dialogue, particularly more elevated dialogue, if you really want your story to engage your reader, is you've got to try to avoid the he said, she said. Where are you going? He said. To the park. She said. Why are you doing that? He said. Like, there are more words than said. So make sure you do some Googling, some looking up, all right? Where are you going? He exclaimed as he ran after her, clutching his backpack over his shoulder. Infinitely more interesting than, where are you going? He said. All right? So, but you do have to know who's talking, how they said it, and why they're saying it. Your character should always have some motivation for talking. You also need to make sure you explain to people how they said things. They exclaimed, they whispered, they, grunted. There's all sorts of words you can use. We need to know how they said it, not just that they said it. Because we all know when you say the phrase, where are you going, there's lots of different ways you can say it. I mean, you can be really confused. Where are you going? Or you might be yelling after somebody, where are you going? Making sure your reader understands how your character said something does a lot to not only engage your reader, but to further develop your characters in your story. Remember, dialogue should always have quotation marks at the beginning and end, and punctuation is super critical to writing dialogue. And I would say punctuating dialogue is probably the one thing students have the most struggles with, because it's not something you do very frequently. So it's one of those things where you're like, wait, where do the quotation marks go? Does the period go inside or outside the quotation marks? So let's take a look at an example. Dialogue is always made up of a couple of parts. There is the actual piece of dialogue itself. I can't believe we have a test today. And then there's what we call the dialogue tag, which is the he said, she said part. Stephen let out an annoyed grumble. In this case, that's our dialogue tag. All right, we are tagging who's talking and how they said it. So in this case, the dialogue tag is in the front. We punctuate with a comma. We open our quotation marks. We type our dialogue, and then we end our sentence, noting that the period lives inside the the quotation marks. Periods always live inside quotation marks, all right? They want to be a part of that hug. Make sure you end your sentence, then stop your dialogue from happening. So in this case, dialogue tag first, comma, dialogue, period at the end. Now, your character can say multiple things. They don't have to just say one sentence. So if this person could have said, I can't believe we have a test today. I was out yesterday and didn't have a chance to study at all, period. They can say multiple sentences in that piece of dialogue before you close it. But once you close it, that character has stopped talking. Now, you can flip it around, place your dialogue first, and then place your dialogue tag, like in example 2. Why can't we just stay home? Renee whined at her mom. So here in this case, we have a question mark. Question marks live inside the quotation marks as well. And then the dialogue tag is at the end. So we ended our quotation with our punctuation, then we have our dialogue tag, period at the end of our sentence. Maybe a slightly more elevated form is the third version, where you can break up your dialogue with your dialogue tag. You know how this works, Jake said with a sigh. You have to study. Actually, you have to study. You know how this works, comma, Jake said with a sigh is our dialogue tag, punctuated with a comma, you have to study, ending our sentence with a period. It's always best in your narrative to try to utilize at least 2 different forms of structuring your dialogue, all right? You don't necessarily have to use all 3, but if you structure your dialogue the same way every time, the structure becomes really repetitive for your reader, and it's not as interesting. Remember that narratives always have to have conflict. Many students are very familiar with identifying conflict in other stories. We talk about, character versus character, person versus person conflict. We talk about a character versus other characters or a group of people in a story. We talk about, our character versus nature or character versus society, or even just a character versus themselves, their own internal dialogue or monologue as they're working their way through the story. And you can often have multiple conflicts in a story. I would say the more conflicts you place in your story, the more complicated, all right, structure becomes, because you have to wrap up and resolve all of those conflicts. So often it's also helpful to think about what kinds of conflict work together. So sometimes when a character is experiencing internal conflict, they're struggling inside themselves with an issue, like maybe whether or not they should tell their friend the truth about something, they might also have an external conflict. Because think about it, oftentimes when you're emotionally struggling inside yourself, you lash out at other people. All right, so they might also have an actual conflict with that friend. Maybe they're yelling and arguing because that character's picking a fight because they're trying to push them away to avoid having to tell them the truth. So it's always worth thinking, if you're going to introduce multiple conflicts, how conflicts work together to advance your story. But remember, it's always about who against who or what. And what does your character have to deal with? Are they dealing with themselves, nature, the rules of society, a particular person? And remember, all stories have a conflict. You can't just avoid conflict in your narrative, just like you can't avoid conflict in life. It happens sometimes. The other key element to a narrative is that they always have an inciting incident. There is something that gets the action going. So remember your plot mountain. Once you make it through the exposition and we establish who our characters are, where they are, and why they're there, something has to happen to get the storyline going. If I think back to the example I mentioned earlier, my favorite movie, Back to the Future, with Michael J. Fox from 1985, the original, not the other two that come to follow, the inciting incident in Marty's journey is when he and Doc are at the mall. Remember, they're trying to perform their experiment to get that DeLorean up to 88 miles an hour so they can go back to the future. They're even successful in sending Einstein, the dog, back to the future, and he comes back, and we see it with the synchronized watches. But the inciting incident for Marty, of course, is when the Libyan terrorists show up and they shoot Doc, and he has to run away. Marty unintentionally is running away in the DeLorean, gets it up to 88 miles an hour, and though he doesn't mean to, he ends up going back to the future, back to the time in which his parents were a teenager. And that's what sets off Marty's whole journey. He has to make his way, all right, through his parents' high school years in order to solve some problems on his own life, but also to deliver information to try to help save Doc. So Marty's inciting incident is when he accidentally sends himself back to the future, because it kicks off everything else that happens in that movie. And if you think about any movie, any children's book, any novel you've been assigned to read in English class, there is always something that sets the story going. So make sure you have an inciting incident, something that forces your character to start down the journey that is your story. So as you get ready to move forward, think about these elements, and remember, you can do a lot of research about how writers incorporate these elements into their stories, and don't forget to ask for help if you need it.